Okay, people in here. Okay, welcome everyone to this week's Outlook Big Basics seminar. And before I hand over to Sophos to introduce our guest speaker, I just wanted to mention that this is towards the end of this term series of events, but we've got two more seminars coming up. On Friday, we've got Michael Pledge from University of Exeter on environment and health, the search for a healthy environment. So this Friday at 4:15 p.m. And then next Friday at 4:15, we've got a big finale with Sandra Diaz from the University of Cordoba in Argentina, talking about the global biodiversity framework and her experience in the negotiations and the politics that led to the Kunming-Montreal agreement. And then after the event today, we've got drinks around the corner, so just go out and to the left and join us for some informal conversation over drinks. And so I'll hand over to Sebas.
Yeah, thanks. So it's such a pleasure today to welcome Patrick Greenfield. Patrick's a Guardian journalist who is one of the reporters on the Age of Extinction series. I'm Sophos and I'm an ecological economist who works with Professor Joe Bull over in the Department of Biology. So the scene for this talk, the context, is that in the Montreal Kunming Agreement, the international community agreed to sort of upscale financing for nature conservation by $200 billion per year by 2030. And of that, there was a commitment from states to finance an increase to $30 billion a year. So that's $170 billion that are going to come from somewhere. And this is probably going to be through leveraging private finance in some way. So, that agreement envisages that most of this financing will come from private sources. So we now got to recognize that conservation is a big business. It's a really big business. It's a multi-billion industry, and it's got its own incumbents, its own vested interests, and its own political economy. I've been working in the kind of biodiversity offsets world for about 5 years with Joe. And we've had suspicions of kind of additionality issues in offset markets for a long time, but I've never seen anything quite like the bomb that Patrick's investigation threw into this whole world, the whole world of carbon offsetting specifically, but this applies more widely to kind of private financial instruments towards nature conservation. I've had many discussions with people throughout the kind of offsetting academic world about the implications of Patrick's work. And one of the things that really has come up time and time again is how extraordinarily detailed Patrick's work is. I spoke to a professor who said that Patrick actually deserves a PhD for this investigation alone. So without further ado, Patrick Greenfield talking on why rainforest offsets are not working. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. In truth, it was a massive team effort. So as Sophos said, I'm Patrick Greenfield. I was the lead reporter in the Guardian's team on this big carbon offsetting project that we did. Several articles, a podcast, but we worked with, this is not a good time for the clicker to stop working. Here we go. We worked with Zeit, that are a German publication, and Source Material, that are an investigative journalism outlet. And we were looking into this for about 10 months. And it's had a really, really massive impact. I think it surprised us all. From Greta Thunberg to big posts on LinkedIn, ESG bosses, this has really hit at something that I think for everybody involved became a bit of an obsession. And it's great to see that there's so much interest in it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 3 things. The why, how we approached this and why we thought this was such an important subject. The story of how we did it. Really, this is the second investigation that we've done in the last 3 years. And I'll conclude with a third thing on its implications before we open up to questions. But before we get into the why, if you're able, could you please put your right hand up? I want to start by asking questions to see where you are. And I want to begin, everyone right hand up, please. Right, keep your hand up if you're trying your best, however you define it, to change your behavior in response to the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. Right, okay, so no, everyone's got their hands up. Keep your hands up if you still eat meat, if you fly, if you drive. Okay, so a few hands down, right? But many of us that are conflicted. Third question, if you keep your right hand up, if you could pay to cancel out that damage that you know you're causing, unfortunately, but offsets that really do work, keep your hand up if you would pay to do that. So for those that can't see and that are watching online, that's a lot of us. That's not many hands have gone down there. Right, that's starting to ache. And I think offsetting is a really, really appealing idea, right? That good can cancel out bad. So many of us who consider ourselves environmentalists, we know that damage and we do these things and we think, oh God, what can I do to compensate? And we're surrounded by these adverts that is possible, right? I mean, my best friend, my housemate Adam, he's a supermarket manager, and I have bored him to death for the last year with this subject. And we talk a lot about packaging in supermarkets and carbon neutral coffee, carbon neutral ice cream, carbon neutral whatever you like. And I think these adverts get to a couple of things that businesses care and don't want to be part of the problem. I don't think you should be a kind of total cynic about this, but also these are such massive problems, massive questions, and we want to make choices when we're doing things that we all have to do that at least don't make the problem worse. And the other major thing I definitely take from these kind of adverts is that this is big business. This market is about $2 billion now in size, and it's growing, and it will get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the 2 billion refers to the voluntary carbon market, right? And that's a lot of money, and it's totally unregulated. So if you fancy after this summer, you can start up your own carbon standard, and you can be part of that and create your own methodology and sell your own carbon credits. No one's going to stop you. And these adverts behind us, they all rely on the trustworthiness of the major carbon offsetting standards. And the main one, I mean, their figures vary, but it's Vera. They are a Washington, DC based nonprofit. And they were, I guess, kind of founded by the business community, and they approve about 3/4 of all credits in this market. And when you see these adverts that you can drive carbon compensated, you can have your carbon neutral burgers, you can buy Gucci clothes and be entirely carbon neutral, right at the bottom of these adverts, you'll see the small print that says we're relying on VCS, which is the carbon standard that Vera operates, or gold standard, the other one. And when we were starting out in this investigation, we were kind of thinking, well, can we trust this stuff, right? We're not really disputing offsetting, and I know George Monbiot has written a lot about this idea that you're kind of paying to counteract your sins. It's not about that. It's taking it on the terms of these adverts and really seeing if there's anything behind it. And so look, I don't know if I'll get to speak at Oxford again. I was totally honoured to be here. So I wanted to have a go at one of these adverts too. And so earlier today, I have decided that this is Oxford's first carbon neutral lecture. And I have offset the carbon from my trip here from, I mean, some of the CO2 that we're all breathing out right now. Hopefully it's totally compensated, right? And again, carbon, or it's that simple logic that's really appealing that we all saw at the beginning, right? I've caused emissions to be here. I drove. Unfortunately, I didn't take the train, and I know that's kind of made the problem worse in a small way. And the idea here is we're pretty certain about what I've done, and the carbon credits we're looking at, which were all used to substantiate these claims. So every single one of these adverts here is either totally or in part substantiated by various REDD+ credits to be carbon neutral. The idea is that there's some cancelling out there. So with avoided deforestation credits or avoided credits in general, it's not that anything's being sucked out of the atmosphere, it's that you're stopping an emission from happening. That definitely would have happened. And in the case of avoided deforestation, you're stopping trees from being cleared in a threatened ecosystem in the Amazon, Congo Basin rainforest, amazing places that we know we have to keep alive and intact to meet our climate and biodiversity goals. Now, a simple idea, and this is a very, 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 very confusing market. So I saw this last week, Sophus and I were talking about it earlier. This is a map of the voluntary carbon market at the moment. The buy side, the sales side, the supply side, all the different governance bodies. You've got the companies, the different schemes, the credit ratings agencies now. The market now knows that there is a big problem with the worth of these credits, and so it's got its own credit ratings agencies that will tell you what's real and what's not. I mean, where to begin, right? It's really complicated, and there are big name companies, Microsoft, Disney, Alphabet, that use this and see this as a big part of their climate strategy. What else is there to say here? Okay, so what is REDD+? Now, this is slightly more complicated than it sounds. So avoided deforestation, well, REDD+ originally comes from the UN climate process, and it's this idea that countries should be paid for to keep forests standing when they're threatened. But there are lots of different types of REDD+ now, several years later. So what we're talking about today is Vera's carbon standard and REDD+ projects, right? So think of them as national park size. There's now jurisdictional REDD+, which is at a regional level. It works at a national level too. And then you have things like the Amazon Fund in Brazil, which is a form of REDD+, but there are no carbon credits involved with that by design. Let's not go there kind of thing, but today we're just talking about Vera's system and avoided emissions. And Vera's registry is in many ways quite an easy thing to access, right? So you can go right now online, you can look this up. All of their projects are that are part of the verified carbon standard are there for you to access, and you can read through the project documents and the methodologies and the way that the baselines are created to create the carbon projects. And I first did this in January 2020. I checked my emails before I came here. I was asked by the Guardian's environment editor to take a look with a group of reporters from Unearthed, and quickly got lost. They are really, really, really long. There's about 80, 90 or so projects. Each project has the project descriptions are about 200, 300 pages long. The methodologies are very technically complicated. They were written more often than not before the Paris Agreements, and they were kind of best attempts to measure the impact of avoided deforestation. And there are rules in there about in the methodologies about what they can and can't do to create these REDD+ scenarios. So again, I don't think I really answered the question, but in terms of, where are we? Going back here. Well, no, so to fully answer what REDD+ is about, it's about avoiding a worse reality. So the way these schemes operate is they say, okay, this is my chunk of Peru or Colombia or Brazil, and the threat to this forest can be calculated by looking at reference regions and areas that are being deforested nearby. But because we have a conservation project here, this area is not going to be deforested, or it's going to be deforested at a lesser rate. And to calculate what the deforestation rate would have been, they look at these reference regions and measure what's going on there. And that, I mean, there are about 4 main REDD+ methodologies, but under various systems, that then becomes the baseline. And so, and this is how you generate the credits. So say you decide that in your project, in the first year, 1,000 hectares would have disappeared if you'd not been there, and no deforestation takes place, so you can claim 1,000 hectares worth of carbon credits. If 500 hectares of deforestation actually take place in the first 5 years, first year, you get 500 hectares worth, and that's your baseline. And Vera just changed the rules. Before that baseline would last a decade. Now it's 6 years, and they're going to change the system again. But there are lots of issues that are related to this, right? So to name a few, our investigation only looked at the baseline. So it's that counterfactual, what would have the world been like had this project not been there? But leakage is a very common one. This idea that, yes, you might be protecting that area of Madagascar or Indonesia, but really what you're doing is just displacing the deforestation elsewhere. Then you have this concept of permanence, where, I mean, some of these projects are there for 40 years, say, but and you could have a perfect project that has the use high quality impact measures and the rest of it, but in the 41st year, scheme's over, deforest it all, and all of those gains have been wiped out. And so these are not permanent benefits, right? And what else needs to be said here? Yes. A key point about the Vera registry, it's a really confusing organization, but as I said, they're a non-profit based in the US, but the best way to think about them is really that they are a host of information. So Vera don't write the methodologies. They are authored often by private companies or NGOs. And the idea is that you can come and, I mean, for reforestation projects, for, well, not anymore, but renewable energy, peatlands protection, whatever you want. And Vera will have an approved third party that rubber stamps that, and that's how you can start the process of generating carbon credits. And they've been very successful, right? They've hosted this entire system that really has exploded really since 2019 now, right? So they have certified their billionth credit. I think they announced that. Well, I was there. I watched them do it in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. And they have plans to grow and grow and grow. How do we... And just to give a concrete example about how this works. So this is a project that we featured in our investigation. This is in the Madre de Dios region of Peru. And you can see the project's area up there in purple. It's on the border with Brazil and near the border with Bolivia. And this is an area, this is part of Peru that has issues with gold mining and drug trafficking, and there are definitely along the highway that comes in from Brazil, there are big issues with deforestation, as you can see, right? Also across the border with Brazil too. And so under Vera's system, what they do is they go, right, there's our project, where's a suitable reference region? And this, as some of you will notice, is where problems start coming in. So this reference region is meant to be comparable to the project area, but this project area, I believe, is operated by a couple of logging companies in partnership with a conservation organization. And the reference region that has been chosen here is for how the deforestation would have been inside the project area is along a highway, which has a very high deforestation rate. And that you can see that pattern of deforestation all the way down. And we did some satellite analysis on this, and it really is all concentrated around that area. But there are big questions about whether that reference region is comparable at all. It's really, really difficult to get to the project area. And I believe the road that you have to take to get there is one that's already been constructed by the logging company, right? And there's very, very little kind of evidence of deforestation in the project area at all. And but that's how, under the Vera system, using this setup, they forecast around, I think it's about 45% of the project area would have disappeared had the project not been there. So that's an enormous amount of the project, right? Massive. This under Vera system, this project area is really, really, really threatened. And so if you're buying carbon credits from this project, you're buying them on the basis that you're avoiding that damage. And this scheme is really popular, or has been really popular, with big companies in the West. They buy carbon credits from this project and claim they're carbon neutral, and I think often don't go into the detail of what's really behind that. And something that we'll get into later, but has really struck me, is a lot of people believe that they are buying carbon neutral ice cream or drinking carbon neutral water or whatever, based off these kind of credits. So next slide. So we first started looking at this in 2000, and we published an investigation in 2021, and we were looking at the REDD+ offsets that major airlines at the time were using to claim that they were carbon neutral. Again, REDD+, similar story. You can fly carbon neutral, you can do what you like, and we can cancel out the damage. And it was a frustrating time, obviously, because of the pandemic. And but a key thing we were looking at here was evidence of proper impact evaluations, right? Because these are big claims. To say that you're stopping that amount of deforestation, like the example of Peru, that's a lot of deforestation, and you really need to back that up. But at this stage, no evidence really existed, or no studies seem to exist really answering that question with proper techniques outside of the carbon offsetting industry. But in this investigation, I had a key conversation with a professor in Brazil called Britaldo Soares Filho, who was a pioneer in deforestation modeling. And I called him up, or emailed him and then called him up out of the blue, because his name was everywhere in Vera project documents that I've been spending the pandemic reading. And he created a land use change software called Dynamic EGO that maybe some of you use in your research. And they had been used to calculate the baselines, project where the deforestation would be. And there are his studies. There are other studies that he's done that are they're in Vera project documents. And I spoke with him, and he said, "No, this is nonsense. This is not how my research and my software should be being used." But the example I gave there, they were using his software to project out that kind of dystopian reality that they were apparently avoiding based on the reference region and the Vera system. And really, I was a bit frustrated with after this investigation, because not much seemed to come of it. Eventually, 5 months ago, EasyJet, who were using a lot of these credits, said that they were not going to use offsets anymore. Before that, they said, they went from you can fly carbon neutral to something else, and now they've dropped it completely, and they've got a different strategy. But I always had these two men at the back of my head. So on the left, it's Michael Boozer, and Professor Michael Boozer, pardon me. On the right is Professor Dean Carlin. They were my lecturers when I was studying, doing my master's at Yale in international development economics. And especially Dean Carlin, who is now chief economist at USAID, he would go on and on and on about the claims that NGOs made with their impacts on poverty, mainly, that they were apparently alleviating, and they weren't based on any proper methods. And we studied those over and over and over again. And this was about when I first started going through Vera project documents. I thought of him a lot. He was very, very passionate about, or I imagine still is very passionate about this subject. And he would get us to go through NGO impact reports and find examples of kind of major claims that weren't actually backed up by proper evidence. And so that's really what the investigation became. And in this time was waiting for studies where we could do that. And in terms, the world has gained a lot from these kind of methods, right? And they've been recognized twice by the Nobel Prize for Economics in the last 5 years. Dean Carlin, his Banerjee and Duflo, I think, were his PhD supervisors, right? And they won the Nobel Prize in 2019. And then in 2021, the economists that were responsible for the credibility revolution in economics were recognized. And I've had the honor of going through our data from the latest investigation with Guido and Benz after we published, after some doubts were raised about it. And I mean, from, I don't know, measuring the impact of COVID vaccines and how many lives have been saved, we use these methods all the time in other fields. And it really is, it's my opinion that the credibility revolution has now arrived at the door of conservation. And it's uncomfortable, right? Because I mean, there are several researchers now out there asking questions like, is this doing anything? Is this working? Are our methods actually having the impact that we tell ourselves that they're having? And sometimes the answers are really, really difficult, because many people in this world have dedicated their lives to areas of forests or ecosystems that they're desperate to protect. And yes, these methods have their flaws and limitations, but it's how things are done at the moment. And so to the latest or the most recent investigation and the reason why I'm here, I guess, in the last 3 years, there have now been 3 studies that use high impact methods to broadly answer the same question. Sorry, ask the same question about these projects, various REDD+ projects. How much deforestation are they actually avoiding? And there are 2 groups. So the first, West et al., Thales West, he is a fascinating researcher who I'd encourage you to contact or invite to speak at some point. So he's Brazilian. He used to be a Vera projects auditor, and he used to really believe in the system. Some of the baselines that have been approved that are ongoing as part of Vera system right now, he helped approve, I understand. And I think he kind of became a bit disillusioned with the system, or wanted to, doubt started to grow, and he wanted to find out really, were these having the impact that they claimed? And he uses, I mean, doesn't just use this, but he has used synthetic controls to look at the impact of projects in the Brazilian Amazon. And then it's going through peer review at the moment, but there's another paper now that looks at Peru, Colombia, Tanzania, Cambodia, and some others. And then there was and he mainly uses Global Forest Watch data set. And then there is this other group, Alejandro Guizar Coutinho, who is a PhD student of David Coombs at the University of Cambridge. And they use pixel matching to look at the impact of REDD+ projects in the first 5 years. And this was really exciting when we first started seeing these papers come out, because now we're starting to get some proper answers that we could compare with Vera project documents in our investigation. So because Thales knows the system so well and knows the methodologies and has done the reading of the hundreds of pages that you need to do to some kind of really understand how this works sometimes, his tables in the supplementary material had estimates of the deforestation according to the synthetic controls that projects were actually avoiding, and then also had estimates, I guess, of how many carbon credits he thought they really deserved using synthetic controls. So we could compare those with the Vera registry by downloading it to see in the study time period what Vera had approved and what Thales thought they actually deserved using synthetic controls. The Guizar-Coutinho group, what they did is they produced estimates of how much deforestation projects were avoiding in the first 5 years, and they didn't go that extra step. So I'm sure they won't mind me saying, but they weren't as well read in on how the Vera system works, and almost, I think, didn't quite realize the significance of what they'd had found or come across initially, in the sense that that you'll notice if you read the papers that the tones are very different. Thales's work, along with Erin Sills, Sven Wunder, and some of the other brilliant researchers that have authored these papers, is quite negative, right? The findings are pretty negative. The Guizar-Coutinho paper is positive in tone, right? So what they lead on is a positive average impact of 40 projects, right? So they tried to look at all Vera projects and were only able to look at about half of them. And they found on average that these schemes did have a positive impact at stopping deforestation. However, there is significant difference between projects, right? We're looking at project-based REB+. And I think if you read the study more carefully, you'll see that actually it's a few schemes that are avoiding most of the deforestation, and the majority are either avoiding none at all or tiny amounts. And so from the top of my head, I think it's about 4 or 5 projects are avoiding 75% of all of the avoided deforestation they record in their study, which is not great, because the finding itself is pretty modest. For I think it's about 65,000 hectares they think were saved. But there was enough information there once we asked a few questions about the formula they'd used for their calculations to compare the deforestation that they thought had been avoided using a different rigorous method with what Vera had probably, the deforestation, the avoided deforestation through Vera system that was likely used to generate the credits. That's the most kind of complicated bit, right? So just to explain, it wouldn't be fair to compare the Guizar-Coutinho avoided deforestation figure with just the Vera baseline, right? Because as I was saying at the beginning, some deforestation can happen and you can still get credits, you just get fewer credits, right? So for the comparison in our investigation, we had to discount the deforestation that happened in the project to get an estimate of the deforestation that was likely used to generate the credits, right? But with that, we could do the comparisons that form the basis of our investigation. This is an incredibly boring slide, but this is just evidence of, this is just screenshots of the appendices and the tables where the information that I've just talked about is. The one on the right is from the Guizar paper. They find that, kind of shockingly, if you put conservation project in an area where there is a high threat to the forest, it will avoid deforestation. Whereas if there's low or almost no threat to the forest, you're not going to avoid any deforestation because there are questions about whether it was threatened in the first place. And that is consistent with what Thales is finding. And that, again, to kind of step back, because we've got a bit in the detail there, this whole system relies on threat, right? So in one of the papers we looked at, Thales's papers about Brazil and the Brazilian Amazon, that study cut off just before Bolsonaro took power, right? And I'm pretty sure, they are too, that those Vera schemes suddenly became much more effective when Jair Bolsonaro was in charge, right? Those carbon credits probably have a lot of worth for those vintages or time periods. Carbon credits are kind of like bottles of wine; they have vintages, and that's when the system seems to be most effective, right? If you're in a country like Cambodia or Madagascar, where there are incredibly high deforestation rates, and in some cases the government isn't doing much about it or actively encouraging it, these schemes can be pretty effective. So once we were able to do these comparisons, and to be very clear about what we did and didn't do here. So we're journalists, obviously. We wanted to be led by the studies and the studies alone. So, and we didn't want to speculate about the quality of projects outside of these studies. So, for example, when we were going to compare the West estimates with the Vera registry of the credits that were approved, we stuck very strictly to the study time periods. West's most recent study cuts off, they go from the project start date to 2020, and so that's the period of the Vera registry that we looked at. And quite shockingly, we found that for those projects where we were able to do that comparison, it seemed that 94% of those credits shouldn't have existed, were in carbon terms worthless, nothing, hot air, you name it, right? We spent a lot of time thinking about the right way to communicate that, because it's a tough thing to communicate. With the Giza Coutinho et al. Comparisons, we found that baselines appeared to be exaggerated, sorry, not exaggerated, let's be careful there, to be overstated by 400%. Now, but again, I've made a mistake there, the same mistake I made in the article. The average doesn't really tell you that much, right? So there were 3 projects in Madagascar that were amazingly effective, right? In the first 5 years, they massively outperformed their Vera baseline, and clearly doing something very, very impactful in carbon terms. But if those are taken out, that 400% becomes nearly 1,000%, right? So there are some projects that have really absurdly overstated baselines, others that should be getting more credits. The methodologies aren't capturing what projects are and are not doing. Even when in the few cases where they are successful, very successful, they should be getting more, right? And so why do we care about this? Conservation projects fail all the time. That's not news. But through the logic of offsetting, the success of what's going on in that part of Peru or Colombia or Brazil is tied to these adverts, right? And as I was saying before, several people really believe this stuff. ESG officers messaged me on LinkedIn afterwards. It's their job to know, and some of them didn't question it. And what we then wanted to do was kind of, once we had this bank of projects that seemed to not be working, we wanted to know, well, how are they being used in terms of claims in adverts like this? And one really interesting case was the Alto Mayo in northern Peru, which I visited. And what's very attractive, I think, about Red Plus, this has been very technical and very business-like so far in terms of the way I've spoken, right? Because that's how this problem, I think, is approached by companies. But what I think they really love about Red Plus is they can point to a part of a great ecosystem, a beautiful ecosystem, and say, we are protecting this area. And that is definitely the case with Disney. So this is Disney's net zero claim. And we went through their company reports. This is on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, I believe. And Alto Mayo, I think, is substantiating about 43% or something like that of all of their claims of offsetting, right? They're and something to notice, before the pandemic, pretty much, or just before, their emissions are not really changing and rising really, but they're claiming that actually net emissions are falling using offsets. And Alto Mayo is not just used by Disney, it's been used by Pearl Jam, it's been used by Gucci for these flamboyant claims, right? And we wanted to go see what this looked like, because it was in the West studies, it was in this group that were not having as much impact as claimed, but they were having some effects. And it was important for us to go and see what that actually looked like. And when I went to San Martin province and went to Tarapoto and with Hannah, reported with the Zeit, didn't really know what to expect, but I did kind of expect carbon offsetting scheme to have this kind of border around it when I arrived at the forest, and they don't unfortunately have that. It is just forest. But before I go on, Alto Mayo, I think, has about it was about 85% of this was nothing, right? So we wanted to have a graph that showed that, but that was another graph that was slightly too complicated, I think. But once we'd sorted this trip out, something quite bizarre happened, and I'm sure many of you have seen this John Oliver episode about carbon offsetting. But I was on holiday and had tried to not think about this subject for a little while. I was with my friends, and I got sent the episode and watched it. And John Oliver kind of ridicules the system. He's much less polite than I am about it, and even sets up his own offsetting standard, Oliver's Offsets. And invariably, when they're criticized, put out very, very angry, actually maybe that's, but they put out statements really defending themselves vigorously, let's put it like that. And in this statement in response to John Oliver, which is kind of a variant of he's totally missed the point, he's wrong, he doesn't know what he's talking about, they said if he actually really wanted to understand what Disney's doing and the success of Vera's Red Plus scheme, he would visit Alto Mayo. And that is what I was just about to do. And before we play this video, what's important to say here? So we were going to go visit two schemes here. One is, so San Martin is this incredible province in northern Peru that is just on the edge of the Amazon, and it's in the foothills of the Andes. And I mean, Alto Mayo is the most beautiful place I've ever been in my entire life. It has several carbon offsetting projects, two major ones: Alto Mayo, that's run by Conservation International and the Peruvian National Park Service, and another one called Cordillera Azul, which is used by Shell and lots of other big companies to offset their carbon. And there were issues that have been raised in local media with both of them, more in Alto Mayo in a recent Bloomberg investigation, but it was more that kind of that there had been some rioting and discomfort with the way the scheme operated. But when Hannah and I went there with Angela Ponce, who is an amazing Peruvian photographer who took all of the photos you're about to see, we spoke with local people who lived inside the scheme that was working to avoid some deforestation, right, according to the West study, and said that there was serious problems, and that it was January to May 2021 that communities were having their homes cleared by park guards. And so I just want to play a video. I think this is something that maybe got missed a little bit in what we published, but this is these are videos that were filmed by Abel Carrasco's daughter, she was 15 at the time, and their home was inside Alto Mayo. And this is an example of what we found. Oh, let's stop that. So look, Abel wasn't alone. We spoke with several people on our way to see him. So it's a mountainous region, as I explained, and the roads that are inside the park are mud roads that can't really fit two cars. Well, you can, but they go past each other and you kind of nearly fall off a cliff. And so you have to do it very slowly. But every time we were doing this, the guys I was with, the driver would stop and ask. They'd say, hey, kind of very randomly, there's Patrick from The Guardian in the middle of the Peruvian jungle. He wants to talk to you about the home clearances. And there was always somebody in the car. It was a Sunday we were there, so people were going down to the local market to get food for the week. There was always somebody, sometimes two, sometimes three people, who had their home torn down. And to be clear, it wasn't everybody. There were some communities that were happy with this scheme, right? But many that weren't. I mean, so this is I've forgotten the name of this lady and her son, but her son has learning difficulties, and she I think she was a mother of four. But I mean, I don't think she was doing much illegal deforestation inside the scheme from what we could work out. That's a picture of me speaking with Abel and other people who had negative experiences of the project. And I mean, those of you who study this stuff will know this happens a lot on the edge of forests in these schemes. This is not particularly new. But it's a big problem, right? When we go back to those adverts and those who had their hands up, right? We want to have that carbon impact, I imagine, but we also want to make sure that we're not making other people's lives worse in the process. Those that are least responsible for the damage that we recognise through offsetting that we're doing, and carbon standards need to guarantee against that too. And so when we left Alto Mayo, with the videos that were shared with us and the interviews and that we've done and the rest of it, by chance it was the Koika Congress, which in Lima in September, and that is the Congress of all of the indigenous leaders in the Amazon there. So from Guyana to Colombia to Brazil, they were all there in a big grey convention center in Lima, and they were discussing this subject in detail, right? It's a massive issue, and in Spanish they call them carbon pirates, right? Piratas de carbono. And this is an image of a leader from Madre de Dios province, but I spoke to people from everywhere, and they were talking about being approached by Western carbon offsetting schemes, men in suits who probably look a little bit like I'm dressed right now, who would get off planes and promise indigenous communities the world in exchange for the carbon rights in their territories. They would, I mean, there are kind of terrible stories of I don't know, a couple of laptops and bit of cash being offered in exchange for the carbon rights to their lands, contracts that are only in English in communities that might struggle basic literacy and maybe don't even kind of understand Spanish that well, or Portuguese, or wherever you are in South America. This is a big problem in terms of it being an unregulated sector for these communities. However, they also recognize that it's an opportunity. I'm sure students in this room will over and over again kind of learn about the impact of indigenous communities in forest conservation, and they're the best guardians of the natural world, and kind of maybe always have been in many places, right? And they know very clearly, some of them, that this could be a way to be financially compensated for that. This is a very technical subject, and we spoke with hundreds of people for this investigation, but I would say probably one of the top 3 people that impressed me with their knowledge of this subject was not an academic or anything like that, but it was a guy about my age who was the REDD+ expert for his community, for the Awajún community in Peru. He knew all about how this works technically, and designs of carbon markets and that kind of thing, and the benefits that might come to his community at some point in markets that function well. So it's complicated, right? That's I guess the point of what I'm trying to say here. So look, we published. There was a massive impact. Over 1 million people read our package easily. Definitely the main article, and that's not to show off, right? I'm not telling you that to kind of say, look how many people read our articles. What I took from that, knowing how technical the subject is that it's that thing at the beginning, right? Kind of a lot of people care and were surprised by the findings, and it spelled out in black and white. Our audience is not the same as it might be for a study, right? Our audience are Guardian readers who want to go out and do the right thing when they're shopping and living their lives and are on the internet. And there are loads of people like that, including Andrew Marr. He was kind enough to invite me on his LBC show. I was there next to Richard Tice and saw Jacob Rees-Mogg on his way to the LBC studios afterwards, which was a bit surreal. And it made a big impact in the environmental world too, right? And I hope I know it's opening up conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, about what is working in conservation and what isn't, and what counts as impact and what doesn't. And I should also note that what we have published has been very heavily disputed by Vera and project developers and marketing companies that sell these credits. I've included an example of that there, who have looked at the studies that we used in our to guide our investigation, and say that it's flawed, and that really it can't. They don't quantify the impact of these schemes. There's a lot more that you can't capture. Now look. So one of the things that I'll kind of talk about a little bit more in a second, but there is some truth to this, right? We are talking always, when we think about avoided emissions, in how the world would have been. I don't know how the world would have, what would have happened if I'd not done something, right? Nobody can tell you that. If this system is going to work, we're all going to have to get used to uncertainty, and get over it, right? Because everyone in the carbon offsetting world seems to be able to offer certainty, when that's impossible, right? And I think there are 2 main things that you need for a high functioning system: good quality when we're coming to these kind of schemes, good quality deforestation data, and we need to have methods we can trust, right? And maybe that's something we can talk a bit more about in the Q&A session. But I'm wrapping up now. But the points I kind of wanted to go through to provoke discussion at the end. This is not a new problem. Over and over and over and over again, there have been problems that have been discovered with carbon markets, right? Whether it be the Kyoto Protocol, whether it be this investigation or something else, there are loads of examples of it not going to plan, right? And speaking to some people, often off the record in the carbon offsetting industry, there is a recognition that this keeps happening because we're not learning from failure. We're not learning from where things are going wrong, right? The point of our investigation is not to criticize and condemn and to write off people's career and destroy the industry. It's to highlight the flaws of the adverts and the claims, but also hopefully to give a springboard for organizations in the carbon offsetting world to learn from mistakes and to work with maybe kind of genuine experts in these methods to improve the system. I've already made this point, but look, avoided emission offsets will always be uncertain. We'll never know how the world would have been. But saying that, because you can get very, very complicated very quickly with this, businesses and also crucially developing countries that have tropical forests that will benefit, I personally hope, from systems, not just carbon offsetting systems, but other carbon finance mechanisms, need simplicity as well. If we're going to go with project-based RED+, though the NGOs and the projects need to be able to follow the rules simply. If we're going to go with it at a jurisdictional level, that needs to be something that we can all understand when we're running companies. I don't know, to buy these credits, or we want to do it in our own lives, or when we want to give a carbon neutral lecture at Oxford, right? And the final point, which is a warning really, to maybe some of you in the audience, right? Because I've come across examples of it. As Sofa said in his introduction, conservation, I think, is becoming an industry, and we're at the beginning of a gold rush, and there are risks there for academics too, right? I see more and more partnerships with worrying organizations who, and I'm personally concerned, right? We need a system with integrity, and we should be honest about the conflicts of interest in this system. Something that became a running joke between us is, I don't know if any of you have seen the film The Big Short. It's based on the Michael Lewis book. But I mean, look, those of you in the audience will know something about carbon offsetting to a varying degree, right? But every single human knows the story of something that was made incredibly complicated and had loads of money in it and all fell apart, right? That we know what happens there, and that's what The Big Short's about. And in many ways, I think what's going on right now is an environmental Big Short, but Ryan Gosling doesn't need to take out the Jenga blocks and for it all to fall apart. I think there are paths forward, right? And to conclude with an example, something I'm personally fascinated with that I wrote about last week. It would be easy to say, there's nothing in this idea, we need to stop. But right now, last week, I wrote up a story. There's a US investment firm that wants to buy oil and gas concessions in the DRC and turn them into offsetting schemes instead of exploring for oil and gas. And I mean, Yadvinder was there. Countries in the Congo Basin really need finance to protect this rainforest, which is the last major forest in the world that sequesters more carbon than it emits, right? And not to kind of name names too much, but there are some NGOs that are against oil and gas exploration in rainforests and also against carbon offsetting projects. What do you do? What do you do? What's the way forward? Right? I don't know, but that's something we need to think harder about. But I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening. And please ask as many questions as possible online too as well. Thank you.
Perfect, Patrick. Thanks so much. Yeah, that was such a fascinating talk. So we're going to open up the floor for questions. The first question I'll take will be from undergrads or postgrads, please. And then if you need some time to think about it. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Oh yeah, well, we'll use the
It's so people can hear online, I think.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. That was so interesting. My question was sort of about the response to this from businesses, because obviously for like Disney, this must be like a massive PR problem. They're very sunshine and rainbows, and then that's like a children's home being knocked down. So I was wondering, like, obviously maybe they've not had time to respond, but what the kind of general response is from businesses who've been using these offsets.
They've gone very quiet, actually. No one's really said much, and I have asked, and they kind of point me to Conservation International, who I should say are doing an independent investigation into the videos we uncovered. Demand for these credits has totally collapsed after the investigation. I mean, I get updates on some of the kind of industry newsletters that go out. It doesn't seem like anybody's buying these carbon credits at the moment. Maybe that will change. And I do kind of Google and check who's making what claim at what time, because that changes, and they won't say, oh no, by the way, we're not saying our flights are carbon neutral anymore. I imagine some of that's going on that we've not detected. But I think they don't, I think, because this is a PR question, right? Really. I think a lot of these agencies don't really know what to do, because it was a cash cow, and it was an easy way to take action on the environment. And I think to be direct, it's silence at the moment, and they're working out what the next steps might be. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm not an undergraduate. Is that okay? Have we moved on? Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting, very measured, very really fascinating work, obviously. It builds on that previous question, actually. You've talked about the collapse in the carbon credit market.
Yeah.
And you've also talked a lot about the fact, you recognize that we all emit, we're all responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, so if we want to move towards dealing with these problems, we have to find a way to deal with those emissions, right? So in your opinion, having done all this work, do you think carbon offsets are salvageable? Do you think they are a way forward if they're fixed, or do you think we have to find a different way to deal with the problems?
So my personal opinion is that there will be a role for high quality offsets in the future. I think it'll be a pretty small market once you have integrity in it, because this is threat based, right? So almost every country in the world has agreed to end deforestation by the end of this decade, and so in theory governments are going to be taking action which will raise further questions about additionality. And it's like not hungry hippos. We're going to be putting out fires of deforestation, I hope, in the coming years. But really what we need is a mechanism, I think, a new mechanism. I think we should stop obsessing over making offsetting right. Probably need to be paying countries for standing trees, and that needs to be more generous than the system we have at the moment now for threats, and we need to establish this pretty quickly, and it needs to be something that businesses can contribute to, because I think that's where most of the money will come from. And I don't know, that could be naive, right? Because the businesses don't seem to want to contribute to things like the Amazon fund, which doesn't give out any carbon credits. So maybe what many of these companies want is the carbon credits, and they wash their hands of the issue, and that's that. That's up to them.
Can I have a go at answering that question? So I buy lots of carbon credits, or I help my clients buy carbon credits. And for a long time, I've told them to completely avoid planting trees is a good thing, done in the right way in the right place, protecting standing forest, done in the right way in the right place. It's all good, but never to buy carbon credits for those things. Half the trees in Asia planted don't last 5 years. Newly planted, and the forest was doing its thing quite happily until somebody's gone and have a massive land grab and made a lot of money and told the local people to bugger off, basically. I've seen that happen in Indonesia a lot. So there are so in Glasgow and in Sharm el-Sheikh, there's a big call for national governments to step up in the developed economies to help the global south, I don't know what the right word is, transition into a better future, which is low carbon. So there is a need to transfer money. So in the absence of that, companies can also help that process. So I think carbon offsets, notwithstanding they are complicated because it's permission to carry on doing what you're doing, not actually reduce your impacts. So it's all that kind of complicatedness, but there's a way for a company to participate in that kind of help in the global south. So all my clients, I help them, I say, do offsets which help people, you know, social impact, especially women. So things like cook stoves, which are verified emission reductions. So they have been proven to have happened, not that they might happen, you know, and they're gold standard. So here in Oxford, we have climate impact partners who were climate care. So everybody, I say, you know, go and get them from them. They've been doing this for a long time. So I feel that there are so to put things in perspective, there are good offsets and less good offsets and totally rubbish offsets. So I would suggest not all offsets are bad, and then insetting is also a good thing to do. And quickly, Disney, to call themselves carbon neutral by offsetting scopes 1 and 2 isn't enough. They have to include scope 3. I've got clients where a nice meal at the Trout in Oxford is what it would cost to offset the scopes 1. So I'm also head of sustainability for a printing company, the most sustainable in the UK, we'd like to think, called Secor in Oxford. But their scopes 1 and scope 2 are 0.7% now of their total impacts. And so it's all the impacts is in scope 3. You have to include scope 3. I'll stop now. So.
Can I ask a question? I just wondered if you could let us know if you had any insight into what happened at the specific points of failure. So, for instance, in selecting the counterfactual site of comparison as being next to the main road, what was going on in that particular instance in terms of, I mean, was that a deliberate choice to select something they knew would have high rates of deforestation?
Oh, I couldn't possibly say yes or no to that. But I look, this system is totally open to gaming, right? You can, speaking to the study authors, it happens all the time. Pick a reference region, maximize the amount of deforestation that would have happened. You get more credits. Vera get paid per credit they approve. The project developers pay the auditor. So the auditor, it's in their interest to keep that relationship nice and healthy and not say no to things. Start pulling at this and you'll find lots and lots of problems, right? I think with these schemes, it's forests that are not really threatened or not threatened to the extent they claim. However, to add something on to what that gentleman says, there are big issues with cook stoves. There are big issues with renewable energy. There are big issues in lots of these areas. And I think it probably starts with, companies often start by wanting to make a dramatic claim about being the most X or the most what, and it's probably not the way to go about this, I think.
Thanks, Patrick. From the variety of people that I've spoken to since the articles came out, and apart from the ones that are directly defensive or critical about their positions, there seems to be a tendency of either ones that believe that the methods can be improved, that we can make the voluntary carbon market work, or the ones that feel, as you say, are walking away from this and saying this is broken, the system is broken. And so I think one of the tensions there is, and the ones that think it can be improved is say that, well, we've spent 10 years trying to get this working. It's problematic, and you've highlighted things that are problematic with it. But if we try and reinvent something from scratch, we have to walk away from all the successes or the possible successes like the Madagascar projects you mentioned, which are doing good things on the ground, and say that the entire voluntary sector is broken and we can't just break it down now. So is there, and it might take a lot longer time for larger things like jurisdictional red to work. Do you feel there is hope in methodological improvement to get this right? Or do you feel that actually there's so many potential loopholes in the system that it's better to just walk away?
I think I'll be able to answer that question in a year, right? I think it comes back to how you react to failure and whether you learn from it, and whether, if you're in this world, you really do want to listen we've been accused of kind of wanting to destroy this industry and sector, or we've got a kind of ideological issue with it. That's not the case. And I think it will collapse under, maybe it will probably collapse under its own stubbornness if it's not careful, right? But at the same time, there are not many people in this world. Many have already made a lot of money, and journalists can highlight and criticize and the rest of it, but they could also choose to ignore us and just keep going. And maybe companies want to keep using these credits in a cynical way. And maybe that will be permitted in the future. I don't know. I think my hope, there's a great event tomorrow, by the way, which I didn't think would personally happen, but someone from Vera is on a panel with one of the, maybe two of the study authors actually, that were in the studies in our investigation, along with a technical expert from Pajama, who are, I guess, well, they wouldn't like me saying this, but they are an organization that kind of check the quality of credits. And they're going to talk about ways forward and how impact evaluation can be improved. So that's a positive sign, right? Maybe something good comes out of that. So yeah, time will tell, I think, but they haven't got long.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I'll have a microphone. I'll just channel one from online. There's dozens online, so
Right.
I'll have to be selective. What about restoration as an alternative focus? Because that's a bit, the baselines are a bit more clear around restoration projects and more transparent. Do you think there should be a shift towards restoration type activities?
Of course, I think that's a totally different subject, right? In the sense that we must protect these areas. We must come up with a financial mechanism to protect standing forests. It's not that avoiding deforestation is bad or there's anything wrong with that. If we're going to have schemes that say they're avoiding deforestation, they simply must avoid deforestation. And I would worry that, I don't know, we continue cutting trees down, but don't protect standing forests, which are in the short term more important, right? So it's not an either or. Yeah.
So I think we're going to go till past. So yeah, just heads up in case anyone needs to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
This reminds me a lot about sustainable finance as well, kind of the whole greenwashing around that.
Yes.
And there have been moves like with the EU taxonomy in regulating that somewhat. To a certain extent, do you think there are going to be moves in the same direction for common offsets? Like, what do you think the timeline for that would be?
Yeah, so it ties in, I think, to Vinda's question, right? So in the US, the SEC are clamping down hard on this now. I think companies are going to have to disclose, if they're making a big claim, what kind of offsets they're using, which will, I think, cause I mean, the current offsetting system is not fit for purpose to make big claims. So that needs to be worked out. The EU, I know, I mean, this year they'll move on that. In the UK, the advertising standards, yes, I've forgotten if it's authority or agency, but they're already kind of clamping down on greenwashing, right? But I think they're still working out what carbon neutral actually means a little bit, and kind of what you can say and what you can't. And because you'll note, going back to some of these adverts, there's lots of different ways that you can suggest you're carbon neutral, right? Carbon compensated is the new one. I don't quite know what that means, but yeah, but I think that's a big pressure for these organizations, and could crush them, right? Because if you can't say anything with the credits, what's the point?
Thanks for explaining that through, Patrick. I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the financial flows that are going on here, because if people are paying for carbon credits, but they're getting sort of 90% more than they're bargaining for, that is that the project is delivering in real terms less credit than what is being bought, then it suggests that someone's either the projects have got massive overheads or someone's making really good margins here. So did you get a sense of which of those two options is the reality?
Definitely the latter. I mean,
and who those margins are going to?
Oh yeah, so I think it's as I said, it's opaque world, unregulated. A lot of the offsetting developers and agencies will have pictures of indigenous communities and villages that they're helping, and isn't this fantastic? But it's very clear, it's very unclear how much of the money is actually going to these places, if indeed at all sometimes. And there needs to be much greater transparency about that. My suspicion is it's making a small group of people very, very rich right now, but that is something we're looking at. But someone can prove us wrong, right? Apparently some of the ratings agencies look at this stuff and do check money is being sent, but this is, I mean, even including like industry reports suggest that there's big problems with conflicts of interest and fraud and the rest of it, right? But this is a gold rush, and it's, yeah.
So me next.
Yeah.
You mean the horrific story of the clearance essentially of the homes of indigenous people in these areas. It seems like such a weird response from a conservation organization. They're normally much better at targeting the actual threats rather than destroying the homes of indigenous people. So how did that end up happening? Like instead of dealing with the actual threats of deforestation, clearing indigenous people from their land. But what was their kind of theory of change about how that reserve worked?
So yeah, so right, they're I don't really like the word, but they're not indigenous. They're ronderos, which they are communities that have moved in from the Andes that often have been forced out by mining projects in Peru, and were in some cases encouraged by the government to move to the Amazon to kind of civilize the place and whatever the political rhetoric might have been at the time. And now they're being told, no, this is a carbon offsetting scheme by the government, or so there many had been living there for kind of 40 years. And it became a national or a protected area without them knowing. And then about 20 years ago, Conservation International realized that this was an area where there was deforestation going on, and that if they actually invested in the national park structure, they could lower that rate. But that, I mean, if you've lived there for 40 years or 30 years and didn't know any of this was going on, which is the case with several communities there, and you're being asked to leave or told you can't cut down trees because many of them are coffee farmers with very basic literacy, and some people couldn't spell their own names and that kind of thing, right? They're not following what's going on with national parks and the rest of it. And but actually another further complication is that the indigenous community in that area doesn't really like the fact that there are ronderos around there too, and there are clashes sometimes between them. So it's really complicated, isn't it? But that's how it's happened, because in Peru you don't, in protected areas, the state owns the forests. They have no right to be there. So they have the police and the National Park Service can clear them. That's all legal. Doesn't mean it's right, but that's what's happening, or was happening. Yeah.
Thank you. That was that was a really interesting talk. I have a quick question about, even if you had very robust systems, whereby you could quite accurately say that you'd avoided whatever 500,000 hectares of deforestation.
Yes.
Do you have any idea how these companies then turn that 500,000 hectares into carbon, and what methods they use? Because obviously it's going to be very different depending on where in the world you are, how much carbon you've actually saved, and whether you think there's any gaming going on by using very inflated methods of turning those areas into actual carbon estimates.
Yes, so I'm going to give this a go, but this is a bit that I found. So not every hectare has the same amount of carbon in it. Some forests, and that will differ between countries, different ecosystems. And something that actually seems to be quite good about various systems is that you can't really say that you're protecting 100% of the area from being deforested. You're kind of forced through their methodologies to scale that down. So when you do protect a hectare, you only get to take credit for about half of that carbon. That's what I think happens. But then you do have schemes that are particularly bad that do seem to claim that they're stopping big amounts of deforestation and big chunks of the carbon too, right? If that makes sense. But that is speculation, and I need to go back into the data to look at that.
Hi, thanks. Just want to push back a little bit on Henry's question and your response, because I think we need to distinguish between price and cost. So I only know one project really well, which is the Sima project in Cambodia. And there, I think, the price you get for a carbon credit is a contribution towards the massive cost of conservation, which includes both carbon biodiversity and local well-being and livelihoods. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that someone's getting rich, although maybe someone is. But I think on the ground, the conservation projects are not necessarily getting rich because the price of carbon is low comparative to the cost of actually doing the work. And then my question is, what does this say for biodiversity credits? Because we're going to have a big biodiversity market too, and it would be nice to get it right from the beginning.
Okay, so on that point, to clarify, the way this seems to work, this market seems to work, is you have really PR agencies in the middle, right, who might buy up large chunks of credits at a cheap price, and they will sell them on for a much higher price, and that's probably where there are people coining it, right, and project developers and others too, right? Just to clarify on that. Called biodiversity offsets, right? So it's in the I was in Canada for COP15, right to the bitter end, and offsets is in the agreement, so that's a fact on the ground. That's going to happen. Well, look, avoided deforestation, as I say a lot to my editor, that is a proxy for biodiversity offsets too, right? Justifiably so in many cases. And very simply, I think we've got to start with the science, and maybe a lot of the offsets have to be done after the fact, right? Maybe we should only be relying on systems where we can know and show with good quality methods and the best data we have, recognizing the flaws and the holes that are in all models. But maybe that's what we need to go with, and not have a system where we're kind of imagining how the world would have been that's not as robust.
In your conclusion, you were pleading for simplicity.
Yes.
But for something that is so complicated, I'm not quite sure whether this is the right way to go, because I myself, I have been the reviewer of the first VCS RED certification scheme.
Yes.
And I complained bitterly exactly about this. And of course, I was not heard. Otherwise, we would not be sitting here.
I'm sorry.
And well, sometimes serious. And it's really going more towards, fighting the drivers of it and really getting this into the methodology that you actually know what you are spending the money for and really attributing it. And this is a little more complicated than simple.
Yeah, sorry. Again, to clarify, simplicity, I think we'll probably do need very technical systems, right, to at the heart of this, but simplicity for the people in the supermarket, simplicity for companies that want to buy these credits. That's what I mean by that. You cannot expect even ESG officers to, I don't know, that you have one credits that set credits that are based on synthetic controls and others with pixel matching, and another uses a certain type of method. That all needs to be sorted out by people who know what they're talking about, and that's what we need to trust. That's what I mean by simplicity, so we can trust what comes out the other side. Maybe that's naive. Yeah.
Okay, final question. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering how you think this will change how companies interact with the sense of place on a project, because you were highlighting how that's what makes these so attractive by attaching something so abstract to a specific location. So I was wondering if you've seen or what you think will happen if companies will diversify the locations they invest in to guard themselves from that risk of being criticized, or if they'll instead do a little bit more due diligence to try and choose projects which have better underpinnings, and if you think that could be a net positive of companies maybe more critically evaluating the sources of their offsets.
I don't know how cynical to be about this, right? Well, lots of companies are paying these third parties to check independently the quality of what Vera is approving, right, and Gold Standard and the others. I I don't know if I'm particularly hopeful in terms of, oh God, I just don't know how to answer your question. Could you re-ask it in a shorter way? Sorry, just to, it's kind of escaped me. Yeah.
Do you think that because of the like place issue, so for example, the one that you two are trying to
Yeah.
the companies will diversify and invest in a ton of places, so it's harder to pin them to one?
Right.
Or do you think they'll do more due diligence and try to attach to really good projects?
Sure. Okay. Right. So some already do that. Often they will have one project that is the chunk, like the main chunk of their credits, and they'll have, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 others. There is a startup in the UK that I know does the portfolio approach thing, and you invest in lots of different projects at the same time. But what I hope our investigation has highlighted is that if you have lots of different projects that all rely on 1 or 2 pretty shocking methodologies for measuring impact, that's going to have bad results across the board, right? And this is a structural problem, and I don't think a portfolio approach is really going to sort this out. And kind of crucially, the reason why I said kind of Vera is this hosting organization is I've spoken with some of the methodology authors who recognize big problems with what they've written. And I mean, problems were highlighted a long time ago. We know that, but they know there are issues. Some of them will at least acknowledge that, but they won't be solved by portfolio approaches. Yeah. One more or no?
No, we're out.
Okay.
So last thing to say is thank you so much to Patrick Greenfield for being here. What a talk! I learned so much. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.